Well, good afternoon. It's, I must say, a great pleasure and a great honour to be here and to be back in the language unit where I was very happy 50% of the time and not here the other 50%. And I'm just going to do something very, very basic. I'm going to try to, basic but ambitious, I'm going to try and explain what applied linguistics is in 20 minutes. So, what is linguistics? Linguistics studies language, and we can study language at a variety of levels. We can study the sounds, we can study what we could call syntax, the way sentences are put together. We can study the words in the language. We can study the meanings which the words and the syntax together produce. We can study the way that language is used. So what do we mean when we say, what do we mean when we say, have you eaten yet? If we say, have you eaten yet to someone in Sweden, we usually mean, are you hungry? Would you like some lunch? But in China, I understand, this is like saying, where's Björn? No, this is, am I right in saying that is like saying, nice day, isn't it?
Yeah, but...
And finally, we can study discourse, which is looking at whole texts, whole interactions, rather than the individual parts. We can look at it another way around, and we can say, well, what kind of linguistics is it? Is it comparing different languages? Is it looking at what goes on in your head? Is it looking at what goes on in society, how language functions in different social contexts? Is it looking at how language is developed to how it is? Is it looking at quite a theoretical level at what language could be? And there are a whole range of other possible areas. And in both respects, we can apply this knowledge. So applied linguistics is the engineering of linguistics. It's taking what the science of linguistics has discovered and applying it, I would say. We use the tools of linguistics to solve relatively practical problems. I've got a couple of examples. Sociolinguistics, one could apply in what is called World English studies, because it's very different. The use of English in China and Hong Kong, the use of English in India and Bangladesh are very different. And if we know this, then we can understand better what's going on in our interaction with people from those areas and what our expectations will be. Something that Becky has already worked on is the question of automatization. So we can call this applied psycholinguistics. When we are speaking a language we are very familiar with, we work automatically and quite fast. The less familiar we are with the language, the slower we work. And so that, and there has been quite a lot of quite technical psycholinguistic work on the idea of automatization and speed in language use. Applied linguistics is a lot of things. Nearly all of them studied somewhere in Stockholm. So if I start at the top and think about language technology. Here, in this department here, speech, music, and hearing, there's a lot of work on automatic machine production, automatic analysis, automatic reception of language, so that eventually we will be able to talk to machines and they will be able to answer us in a sensible way, in any language we feel we wish to. Related to that, there's a lot of work in different parts, actually, of KTH on computer-assisted language learning. How can we use this knowledge about automatic reception and production of language, how can we use that to teach people languages? And that leads on to what is a very, very big area of applied linguistics, and that is second language acquisition, simply the study of how languages are learned. What are the processes involved in language learning? How does that relate to the environment and to other factors? At the bottom right, I've put educational linguistics, and I've just learnt that this school will begin to work with teachers of engineering, teachers of technical subjects, and educational linguistics would look at how does language work in education, how does language work in multilingual education environments, how do we acquire the language of the discipline. Critical discourse analysis looks at texts as discourses, and looks at the power relations that may be involved in them, the ways in which they work in constructing attitudes and ideas, perhaps in a concealed way. Language policy, I've sort of said that language policy, språkrådet deals with it, but actually language policy, of course, is a big issue everywhere in all institutions. What is our policy? And you, I know, have just produced a language policy, and that's also a piece of applied linguistics. One issue which you're going to hear a lot more about from Maria and Britt-Louise is what I've called situated language practices. That is, how do we use language in different environments? How do we use different languages? Who speaks what language to whom in different environments? What sort of texts are produced, and that kind of thing. And an area that is also quite important, but is really the same thing as situated language practices in a way, rhetoric, except that rhetoric asks not what do people do, but what should people do. So in the various contexts that we have studied, what is effective? So in a way, the two are coterminous, but they are whereas this is this would be descriptive research, this would be, okay, what's the next step? What do we do to teach people how to do this better? Terminology, I think, is mainly dealt with by Terminologicentrum in Sweden. And translation, I don't know that you have translation studies here at KTH. There's a unit at Stockholm University that specializes in it. I'm not going to talk very long about situated language practices, because I think that's what Maria and Britt-Louise are going to talk about. Just to say that situated language practices would mean that you look at many different situations, you try to see what people say, what people do, what people write, in what languages, and just try to understand and describe what is really going on. Often, I think, producing very surprising results because there's a lot of folklore. There's a lot of folklore about it, and Britt-Louise was talking earlier about the English language classroom in Sweden and how much Swedish there is in the English language classroom. And these are the kind of things which we find by examining these situations. Situated language practices examines a whole bunch of areas to see what goes on linguistically. Rhetoric then thinks, okay, what could we do to make language use more effective in that area? And there is a body of knowledge about the kind of practices that are effective, but we have to look at each individual field to find out what is in fact effective in that area, and then teach people to do it. And I mean, that's what the world is full of people complaining that engineers can't write. And what they mean is, well, they're quite good at writing, but their writing is not as effective as it should be. I'm going to sort of focus a little bit on second language acquisition. The study of second language acquisition is has become, over the last 30 or 40 years, it's now a very well-researched subject about which we know quite a lot. And I can ask some questions, which I could start perhaps in Do I get an arrow? Yes, I get an arrow of sort. I could start up there by thinking, okay, it's easy enough to see how we teach a language. It's not easy, but one thing that's very important is how is it automatized? How can we make people use the language easily and fluently? And what is the difference between knowing the language and having automatized it? What role do individual factors play? We are going to be faced with a group of students who are going to be very different from one another. What types of motivation what effects do different types of motivation have on the learning process? What effects do different learning styles have? And this is a very striking feature, I would imagine, of KTH, that the learning styles of engineers will be very different, or are quite likely to be very different from the learning styles of people in other environments. Skipping my long box at the bottom, I'll go to here. Okay, so now we know about motivation and automatization and so forth. What tasks would be suitable? Would be there's a big element in second language acquisition which has studied different types of learning tasks. An area which is just beginning to attract a lot of interest is third language learning. Because we talked about second language acquisition, but that means learning another language. And very often, more and more, it is in fact a third language. And so there are two areas of particular interest, I think. Either we've got people who know Swedish and English, and now we're teaching them a third language. How will that affect the situation? And the other is we've got people who know Kurdish and Swedish, and how is that going to affect their learning of English and a fourth language? I think both of those are areas which, in which research is both being carried on but is very much needed. And of course, in this environment, the question of we have this wonderful technology. We can do these fantastic things with computers. But which of them are actually useful? Which of them actually lead to learning? And which of them only look as if they lead to learning? And so there's been a great deal of, in the last, 20 years, there's been a great deal of material using computers and other technology in language learning. And unfortunately, I don't think we can say that we've noticed a massive improvement in language learning in the last 20 years. So there is, we have this fantastic powers, these fantastic facilities, and they needs to be a lot of work on their application. To go down to my big box at the bottom, I think these are all research areas of LSP, of second language acquisition, which could well be relevant in this present context. But we also have to think, we want to develop LSP, languages for special purposes, languages for engineers, languages for doctors, languages for sales personnel, languages for nurses, LSP, languages for specific purposes. And we need to think about, okay, we want to have teachers who are going to teach languages for specific purposes. What do we need to draw on second language acquisition to give them? And perhaps even more importantly, in the parallel language environment, where people get rung up one afternoon and told, oh, by the way, your course tomorrow morning will be taught in English. That'll be all right, won't it? And this sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Or worse still, oh, by the way, your course tomorrow morning will be in Swedish instead of English. That'll be all right, won't it? Not a phone call I want to get. But second language acquisition, the knowledge that comes from second language acquisition could be very useful in intervening between the phone call and the actual lesson. I'm going to conclude by saying that there is, of course, a lot of research in applied linguistics in Sweden. It's going on in many places in KTH, we've seen that. It's going on at Chalmers, mainly on English and Swedish. At Uppsala and Stockholm universities, there are a there is a large amount of activity in the Nordiska språk departments, whatever the English for that is, in the language departments, French, Italian, and at Uppsala University there's a fairly well-known group of people who are interested in language policy, who have, I think, been very influential in the formulation of Uppsala University's language policy in the natural sciences. And there's a science education group which has been studying English as a medium, the effects of using English as a medium. And at my own university, again, Nordiska språk, again, the language departments, English, French, and there is a center for bilingualism research, which is doing studies on second language acquisition. And there is our very own Center for Academic English. There's a lot of research going on in different areas, not enough, I think, considering the complexity of the situations that are arising and the specificity of the situations that are arising. What English for engineering students and for engineers, other languages for engineering students and engineers, how much Swedish, what Swedish rhetoric does an engineer need? I'll be finished long before that. I'm running out of ideas. How much Swedish do you need to cope in working as an engineer, working as an engineering company in Sweden? These are all things which we don't know, and which I think the education suffers in many ways from not having, I would say, very clear and very definite ideas based on a few anecdotes that someone told us. I think we need to have a little more applied linguistic research in this environment. And as I say, I've run out of ideas. So.